Hey, Catherine. I'm just leaving everybody in the waiting room at the moment. Are you able to unmute, Catherine? Hey, there she is. I see you. Do you see me? Yes. I see a smile. A little bit of a change today. I can't hear you. Oh, don't let people in just yet. Oh, well. Lee, you're good?
Yes, just pulling it up right now.
Catherine, you good?
So is Catherine and me, or is it Penny and me?
It's Penny and Lee and Catherine.
Oh, great. Okay, let's go for it. Hello, everyone. I'm a little sweaty, but I'm spotlighted, so hello.
Hello.
We just finished our Zumba, so it was a blast.
Awesome. It looked awesome. We're just getting set up here. Let's admit everybody then. Hello, everybody. I see people I recognize. That's awesome. Just going to wait till people come in.
Familiar faces there for sure.
Can you hear me now?
Hi,
Yes,
Curtis.
we can. That's much better.
Okay, so much for the headphones.
Oh, this is awesome. All these wonderful faces, or at least names. I don't see a ton of faces, but I see a lot of names that are up on the screen.
Quick shout out to Angel for that Zumba. She just popped in the chat there for a sec, so thank you.
That was great. Oh, Sheila, you got a camera working. Just going to give everybody a few minutes to come in, get set up.
Lee, which chat are you looking at that you saw?
We lost Catherine.
Really?
Where did she go?
I see her.
Here.
I don't.
I'm here.
There she is. Hi.
Hi. Which chat are you looking at? Because mine has nothing in it.
The only chat that you will see is in the Whova chat.
Okay, so no messages yet. Is that right?
Not yet. No, I can't see anything yet.
Oh, okay. I thought Lee had said there were messages.
No. I was just saying hi to everyone. All right, Penny, how we looking?
I think we're pretty good. Let's kick it off. So, I lost my notes. All right. So, I just want to start by saying good afternoon, and I would like to acknowledge and respect the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Coast Salish, Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Stalo, and Kikite territories on which I live, learn, play, and work from during this conference today. I was just watching the Zumba and it looked very energetic, and I hope you all have still lots of energy left to get you through the whole weekend. And it is my pleasure to, and a great honor to address everybody, and I just lost the notes. There they go. This very first BCSSA Virtual Spring Conference and to be able to meet with you all here today. For those that don't know me, my name is Penny Bartel, and I am the Provincial Manager at BCSSA. This is my very first conference, and I'll just also say that Daddy Shields was supposed to be here presenting instead of me, but unfortunately he had an emergency meeting and is unable to be here just yet. But my co-host tonight is Lee.
Hello, everybody. I recognize quite a few of you guys from previous years. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. I was elected coaches rep. I've been coaches rep for a couple of years, and my name is Lee Vanden. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish and Sunnimal territories, which I live, learn, and play upon and coach upon, and that we also are having. I'm coming from this conference today. So yeah, some of you may know me. Some of you may not. I hope to get to know most of you throughout this conference and speak at least a little bit with every single one of you, so I can sort of get a gist of how everyone's feeling during these trying times. I've been to, this is my third conference, third official conference. Last one I was trying to organize as well, but as you know, our season got a little bit janky. So as it is, I'm currently also the head coach of the Nanaimo White Rapids, and I am very honored to be in that position, and I see all 14 of my coaches here, which is wonderful. So we're doing good. So I'm going to toss it back over to Penny.
So obviously we're online because of the pandemic, but aren't we glad that we have computers and technology that allow us to be online and at least meet this way? And technology has really helped us stay connected this year. But I think I've been in more online meetings this year than any other year. And it's been a little much.
Definitely. Zoom is definitely, it's the year of online education, online learning. And I know a lot of you guys are students, so you're really feeling this, and hopefully you stick with us the whole weekend, and we can make it a little bit more entertaining than your typical English class. But with that in mind too, I think this is also the first conference we've ever had where we've actually included club members and board members as well as coaches. Can you think of any other ones before? I know I can't, so.
I don't know, because this is really, it was only just over a year ago that I joined BCSSA, but I wonder, Catherine, do you happen to know? Oh, we can't hear you again. We can't hear you. No. Oh, well.
Take that as a negatory for now.
Yeah. No, we lost her. I've never had trouble hearing you before. Oh, well. We'll keep working on our technology there, isn't it? Oh,
yes, keep going.
Oh, I heard you.
Did you hear me?
I
oh,
did.
Okay, so I have a working microphone headset, and I can only hear everybody out of my computer. So I'm not 100% sure, but I know that in previous conferences there have been rare breakout sessions, and but it's always been focused on the coaches for the coaches conference, and parents and board members have gone up to help out, and there's occasionally been a breakout session for club executives, but this is definitely a first, and it's definitely something that everybody is very excited about, that we as in Penny and Lee have been able to pull this together with so much of a different way of doing things, and also getting a variety of input from different executive members. So I'm Catherine Schwichtenberg, and I'm the Provincial Registrar, and I'm coming to you and would like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional, the ancestral, and the unceded territory of the Chiam and the Stolo nations. I'm in Agassiz. And so I very much appreciate and value that I am able to work, live, and play on these lands. I am here representing our president, Danny Shields, who, as soon as he heard that the date was booked, said, well, I know what I'm doing this weekend, nothing else but the conference. So I know that he was very sad not to be able to say his welcome, but have no fear. You will see his face in and out. As soon as he's done this last minute meeting that he had to go to, he will be back. So on behalf of Danny and the entire British Columbia Summer Swimming Association Board of Directors, I would like to wish you all a very warm welcome to the weekend, to the conference, and I wish you all a very fun, interactive time.
Fantastic. I'm glad we could hear that. We got it working. I've got 2 screens, so if you see me looking over to the side, it's because that's where I've got my picture and everybody else's picture on it. But yeah, this weekend's conference theme is Recover, Plan, Succeed, which seems like 2021's theme for me, at least. I need to recover from what's been going on in the last 12 months. I feel like I've learned that I need to pause and reflect and recover from that. Not only as an individual, but for BCSSA as an organization and all of the swim clubs, you probably all need to recover. But then you need to step up and make new plans, and you can't just do what worked before because COVID is changing every single day, apparently, and how we do things. So it is an opportunity for us all to come together and do things differently, bigger, better than before. And that's where success comes in. If we make a good plan and we execute that plan, we're going to all succeed.
I know I'm a big fan of this theme myself, because I know, being a coach and knowing a bunch of these coaches in our clubs out here after doing all of the COVID Cup things last year, it really is, this is an advancement of how we can move forward this year. So recover, plan, succeed. Perfect. And hopefully this week everyone will be able to, or this weekend everyone will be able to take something away, whether you're a coach or board member, but especially coaches, because hello, I'm a coach. I'm going to take a lot of things away from this weekend. And I know that because we helped book a bunch of awesome speakers for you guys. So on all fronts, and hopefully you all find them wonderful as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And Lee, do you know why we have such a great conference lineup?
I mean, like, besides the fact that we organized it, no, tell me.
Well, as great as we are, it's because we've got some great sponsors, of course. And we have sponsors that continue to support us last year when their business and their financials got pulled back and they were struggling. They still maintained that support of BCSA.
So over this weekend, we want to thank those sponsors as well. So I know they posted some, they have sponsor pages themselves, and they have some videos and some profiles on the Whova app. So please do take some time to take a look at them and appreciate them, because without them, we couldn't really make this happen. Yeah.
So let's just quickly name them. 2 sponsors have committed to supporting BCSSA for a full year at a gold or top level. So Active High Tech and Team Aquatic Supplies.
They're very familiar names to all of us, I think. And then down in our silver tier, we have Esquire Wholesalers with their continued support, and Swimmingly, which is a new silver tier that we have. And we'll be learning a lot about Swimmingly in this conference, as we have a whole session around it for any board members or anyone interested in really going to that.
Oh, and also coming in to support us this weekend with the conference is Metrics Insurance Brokers, Ready in 5, and VS Sport. And you will meet all of those later in the weekend. Metrics and VS Sport have sponsored some prizes for some of the contests. So thank you very much, BCSSA sponsors. Oh, it's me again. So I'm new to the BCSSA family, but I know that you guys all, many of you have been involved for a long time. And I was so impressed to hear that on a typical summer, which of course I haven't witnessed yet, but there's more than 5,000 kids that participate in the programs, and over 250 coaches supporting those kids. And even the $10 million of tourist cash that flow to local BC communities. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, so I can second that pretty hard. I came here from Alberta, and there's nothing quite like BCSSA. A lot of you guys grew up here. Man, there is no other swim community like it. So it's super cool, and I'm glad to see that we continue to be strong and grow through it, and continue to do so as we can keep doing it. So I'm going to keep saying that. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, we have a new Inclusion and Diversity Committee of BCSSA, and I'm a chair of it, so I need some input at some point this weekend. So I'm hoping to talk to a bunch of you on what path that committee should take.
Awesome. Did you know that only 3% of people with disabilities participate in phys ed activities that are organized?
No, I did not, Penny.
Well, you should as chair of the committee, Lee.
I know. I will be learning a lot throughout this weekend, hopefully, with our lovely main key presenters, including Elizabeth Walker-Young, coming in to talk a lot about it. So, but I did know that only 2% of female youth get the recommended 60 minutes of physical activity every day. So we need to do better.
Well, I think everybody that just participated in Zumba, you guys got your hour. That's awesome. Just on the All Youth Matter note, so Elizabeth is doing a wonderful presentation later, and it is part 1 of 2. You have to attend both of them to get the certification and to get your PD points for those interested in MCCP points. But just a schedule change note is that she will be presenting at 7:45 right after networking. She really wanted to give everybody the opportunity to do both and not have to make a choice between meeting everybody or doing the workshop. So you can do both.
Yeah, so hopefully that can help a little bit as an incentive to go to that. The professional development points is always nice to have, and helps us out as coaches sort of make sure that we have the right certs and branding for ourselves, as well as so we have the knowledge to actually benefit our kids, which is what we're all about. So yeah.
And speaking of incentives,
we're also running a contest during the conference. Some of you may have already participated at this point, so there's a bunch of polls and questions and fun things coming up. I think, yeah.
there's actually there's a photo contest, actually 2. So upload your photos and there's details there, but we want to see dry land swimming photos and in water swimming photos. Feel free to take some shots during our exercise, our breaks during this during the conference, or you can take something that you've used before. That's fine. Upload them all.
Yeah, thank you to Via Sport for that too. And that's not all we have. Some of you that are already on the Whova app may have found a lovely little button called a leaderboard. And there's some people on there that are quite high up. Izzy P from Nanaimo White Rapids. Izzy R from Rapids. Sorry, not P. So yeah, take a look at that.
Yes, whoever is at the top of the leaderboard by Sunday at 3, I think it is, will win a conference registration for next year. So that's pretty cool.
I can win that too.
Yes, I need to, I'm gonna have to just turn this over to Lee because our keynote speaker is calling me on my line.
Oh, excellent. I'll keep
So
going.
I'm gonna deal with that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
That's all good. I got it from here. Yeah, so as you all know, this conference is a little bit different. We are online, we're virtual. So please you want to familiarize yourself with the Whova app as we go along. There's lots of stuff to go in there. There's polls, Q&As, lots of good stuff. So a couple tips. The agenda on the left of the menu, if you're using your computer, or the bottom of the page in the app, if you're using your phone, that's the key place where you'll find all of everything that's going on. And it'll also be with the link. It has the links to come to every session. So thankfully you all made it to this one. But that's going to be your go-to to make sure that you find the right sessions and what you want to go to. We have 4 different rooms in virtual rooms. So the way it works is similar to as you would in a regular conference. You have different rooms for different presenters to speak. So we can have different subsequents happening at the right time. We have the main pool, we have the warm-up pool, the hot tub, and the club office. So you can find all the links to those sub-sessions and where they're occurring on the app in that agenda. The menus will also help you find and communicate with other delegates and networks. So all of us, by logging in, have actually created a somewhat of a profile. And so, we're going to do a virtual wine and cheese after this and hopefully try and network a little bit and communicate. I want to get to know you guys. You guys probably are seeing some familiar faces and want to reconnect, chat a little bit about how people's seasons are going. So, we're trying to make sure that we can provide some space for that to happen, as well as that is actually made possible by Active High Tech. So thank you
the
to
networking
them.
session.
Yeah.
The networking session is for sure. Yep.
Yeah. So highly bolded in my notes. Make sure that Active High Tech is there. So yeah, please share your photos of BCSSA and articles with us and start communicating. We're here for you guys. We're here to try and make some connection go on. So yeah.
You may also have noticed, I'm back by the way, our keynote was having difficulty with the link. It wasn't working because I think I actually changed the link earlier today. Sorry, Adam. Yeah, so in each session, you probably noticed that on the right-hand side, there's chat and Q&A. I don't know if you just said that because I was talking to him on.
No, I didn't. Continue. You're doing great.
Okay. Anyway, he is on his way in right now, and hopefully he is at least. There he is. Fantastic. So sorry about that. So our first keynote presenter is Dr. Adam Decker, and his presentation is Planning and Periodization using the LTAD. Sounds very high tech, doesn't it? Like we got to be real smart to understand that. So he has a PhD in Applied Health Science from the University of Manitoba. He also has a master's degree in exercise physiology and 2 bachelor's degrees. Whew. Adam is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a certified exercise physiologist.
I also heard that he has worked for Cirque du Soleil.
I don't
Pretty cool.
think he's a trapeze artist, though.
Wow, you never know. And he also recently joined the New Jersey Devils.
Pretty sure he's also not a hockey player. But he is leading sports science for the New Jersey Devils, and he did performance science with Cirque as well. So I'm sure he's got lots of lessons for everyone, and I can't wait to hear what he says. And over to you, Adam. I'm just gonna spotlight you. I'm gonna replace spotlight and give you the ability to share your screen. And over to you. So thank you for your patience in getting in. I did change some codes today, but I didn't think that was one of them. So either way, I'm really glad that you made it in.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Just give me a head nod, Penny, if you can see my screen and hear me okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
That's
okay.
great.
Well, thank you everyone for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll say that I know we were asked to tell you which Canadian Indigenous land we're on, but I actually find myself in New Jersey at the moment working with the Devils. But I will say I'm a member of Manitoba Métis. I'm a proud member of the Métis, and so I'll be here representing the Métis of Manitoba today. So what we're going to be talking about today, as you know, is periodization, but I've also added a layer to that, and we're going to be talking about the importance of daily monitoring. I'll encourage you throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box, and maybe Penny or Lee or anyone else, if you want to, you can certainly interject if you think it's a question that many people will have. By all means, I don't mind stopping. We can stop. I'll do my best to address the question. And then certainly at the end, I plan to speak for roughly an hour and then give plenty of time for questions. This is a big topic. There's a lot to discuss here. You know, I taught an entire university course on this subject, so doing it in an hour and a half is pretty tight. So like I said, I'll do it in about an hour, and then we'll leave a ton of time for questions. So feel free to fill the chat box with questions if you've got them. We're going to start by talking about really traditional periodization. So really the basics, the fundamentals. What's the really important stuff you need to know before delving into maybe some of the newer wave ideas around periodization. So the first thing, for those who have no idea what I'm even talking about, periodization is really just a planned variation in your training intensity, the volume, and the frequency. And really it needs to be more than just your physical training on ice, on court, on field, whatever that is. It needs to include all of your off ice or off field conditioning as well, so your strength and conditioning. It has to include all the things you do in your daily life, so making sure people have a work or athlete life balance is a really critical point. That plays a huge role in recovery, so that's a key one. So we definitely don't need athletes training 23 hours a day every day, so we need to make sure that there's room for their life as well. And by planning all of those things effectively, what we're going to try to do is to stimulate a positive physiological adaptation. In other words, we want to make you better. We want to prevent overtraining. So a major part of periodization is actually planning recovery. I think most people spend time planning to do training. And I can tell you this, I've almost bet no athletes in the world that I've worked with who don't train enough. Most athletes that I've worked with either train too much or just right, and I'll tell you most of them are too much. So often we're not too worried about people undertraining. You know, really one of the focuses of periodization is to make sure that we aren't overtraining the athletes. So building in recovery is critically important. And by doing that, we're going to reduce the likelihood of any sort of injury and also of illness. And really the key one here is we want to promote optimal wellness, And I always say that first because to me, it's really the more important part. We want athletes who are obviously functioning well, but we want them to be happy and enjoying life too. They are people just like everyone else. And the second one is we want to try to promote optimal performance. And so if we can strike that nice balance of optimal wellness and performance, then I think we're doing great jobs as coaches. So I'm sure many of you, and I can see a lot of your faces in the screen here, so maybe just throw up your hands if you've seen something that looks like this in the past. Okay, quite a few of you, yeah. You know, for me, this is really convoluted. It's a lot of detail that probably isn't necessary, and I'll get into the reasons why I think that. But you know, one of the major reasons is basically the second you've developed this plan, probably it's no good anymore because something has changed. And you know, you've all been coaches, you've all had that happen where you've planned a big trip in the middle of summer, and then you find out 2 days later, oh, it's canceled, and and then everything in your plan now has to shift and change. And that's really sport. It's the day-to-day, it's constantly evolving. So these really comprehensive, incredibly developed plans, you know, I think as an exercise to learn how to periodize, I think there's some validity to that and some value. But in practice, you know, I can tell you, I really don't do much of this anymore, this big long-term planning in terms of the microscopic details. But I'll tell you more about that as we go on. You know, for me, really, it's try to keep things simple. I think when it comes to periodization, really what we're trying to do is be organized and come up with a logical schedule that makes sense. So, you know, really try to keep things simple, keep it basic, and that should help guide you in the right direction. So really, what is periodization? Well, really, we're trying to get an athlete from A to B, and we're going to try to do that by avoiding big jumps in their volume, their frequency, and their intensity of their training. So whatever we're doing on day one, you know, we shouldn't be doing triple that on day two. There needs to be a gradual build in volume, in their frequency, and in their intensity. So we want to avoid big jumps in those things. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for recovery. That's an absolutely critical one. And as well, we want to make sure that they are training enough. And like I've said before, probably that's not going to be the issue. Again, most athletes are already training plenty. All right, so some key terms that most of you probably already know, but we'll go through them anyway. The first one is volume. So this simply just means the amount of work you are performing. And that can be, most commonly, you'll see the term sets and reps, and that could be for, you know, swimming, that could be for running, it could be for lifting weights. It's the number of sets and reps you're typically doing. And generally speaking, if you can add an intensity component to that when you're actually tracking your overall volume, that's a good thing because then you're actually tying in the intensity with that as well. And that's the next part, is the level of effort required during an exercise. So if we talk about just something simple that's very easily quantifiable, well, let's talk about in the weight room. So you're in the weight room, you're doing bicep curls, you know, maybe you're going to do 3 sets, 4 reps. So you're going to do a total of 12 reps. And then we're going to multiply that by the intensity or the weight that you lifted. Okay, so obviously if something's really, really heavy, it's pretty high intensity. If something is really, really light, then it's relatively low intensity. And for swimming, it would be the faster you swim, the harder it is. The slower you swim, the easier it is. Okay, and frequency simply is the number of training sessions in a week. And again, that's going to be specific to the modality. So that's going to be specific to your swimming, to your off pool, out of pool conditioning. And any other type of training you're doing. It could be mental conditioning, it could be nutrition sessions, whatever it is. We need to track your volume, intensity, and frequency in all those different things and make sure that that is planned accordingly. Okay, some other terms. Again, probably you've heard these, but we'll go through them anyway. These are 3 big ones that you're going to see a lot when it comes to periodization. So for those of you who are going to go through any sort of like advanced coaching courses, you're going to certainly have to create periodization planning. So a macro cycle simply means, typically anyway, it means 1 year. It can mean multiple years. It can be as much as a quad, so like an Olympic quad, for example. Some people will term that a macro cycle. Generally, we try to say quad if it's 4 years, or triple if it's 3. But a macro cycle, generally speaking, 99% of the time, simply means 1 year of training. So then a mesocycle is 1 month or 1 training block. And training blocks typically should only last around 4 to 6 weeks. And I'm going to explain why we want to stay in that 4 to 6 week range. I'll get into that in just a little bit. But again, so that would be one month worth, or 1 actual designated block of training. Months tend to work out really nicely just for planning purposes, but again, we'll get into that. And then a microcycle is simply 1 week of training. And then one layer below that, of course, is your daily training program. So that's really how we work. We go from macro to meso to micro to daily. And then within that, we have 4 traditional periodization seasons, and they're really simplistic to understand. The first one is your in-season, which is simply going to run from the first competition of your season to your last. And in individual sports, it can vary. You kind of have, it can be bimodal sometimes, where you kind of almost have 2 seasons within a training year, or maybe even 3. And that's totally okay. We're gonna talk about instances like that as well. But generally, you can have, like I said, you can have multiple in-seasons within an actual calendar year or within a macro cycle, but it's your first competition to your last within a designated macro cycle. Okay, your post-season then is basically just an active rest period that follows your in-season. So in hockey, for example, we'll play our regular season, and then at the end of our season, if we don't make the playoffs, we're going to have a period of active rest where we tell the guys that they can take anywhere from 1 to 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 weeks, depending how long our off season is. We tell them to get away from serious specific training, so we get them off the ice. We tell them that they don't necessarily need to be on a specific workout regimen, but certainly want them to be active. We don't want them sitting on the couch eating Doritos for a month, but we want them to be active, but in a very informal way. So maybe they go and play basketball with their buddies, or they bike ride, or do something that's informal, not specific to their sport. It's really meant to provide an active recovery period. Okay, so that's the postseason. The off season then is anything from the end of our postseason, so that kind of get away from your sport, active recovery. So from the end of that to the start of the next year's preseason. That is termed the off season. And the off season really is a misnomer because you're not taking it off by any stretch. Generally speaking, in team sports anyway, the off season is when you're going to do all of your physical preparation and certainly some mental preparation as well. So your off season, really, I like to call it the training season because that's when ultimately most of your training is happening. And then the preseason is going to be a period of around 6 to 8, maybe even 4 to 6 weeks, where you're going to be doing highly sport-specific training leading into the start of your next in-season. So those are the 4 seasons that make up a typical macro cycle. So again, whenever you're sitting down to create your first periodization plan, if you haven't done this yet, the concepts are actually pretty easy to understand, and you're going to see that as we go through the presentation today. I hope that you'll feel like it's not super complicated, and it really isn't, but I'll tell you, the first few times you sit down and try to do it in practice, it can be really tricky. Putting pen to paper with this can be tough. So we'll try to go through a couple of examples today, and again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. So what we always do is when you sit down, you're going to write down your first periodization plan for your athletes. You always want to start by looking at the year first. So basically, the question is, where do my 4 seasons fit within my macro cycle, within my training year? So when is my in-season? What are the dates of that? When is my active rest period or my off-season going to be? Or excuse me, my post-season going to be? When's my off-season? And when is my preseason? So we want to plan for all of those different things. Once we've done that, we've identified our kind of calendar, then we can start to say, okay, what's going to happen in each month of our training plan, or what's going to happen in each block of our training plan. From there, once we know what's going to happen, we can get down to say, well, what's happening every week? So we look at each block of training, each mesocycle, and we say within each week of that mesocycle, what are we going to be doing? What's the goal here? What are we trying to progress? And then we can take it even one step further and say, okay, within that week now, what has to happen on each of those 7 days that make up that week? And so that's really the level of detail you go from. Pretty broad when you're talking about macro, you work your way into your meso, your micro, and your daily program. And if you take those steps, it actually does become pretty easy. So we'll go through a very simple example. So here's one here. This somewhat, reflects a typical NHL season. So I'm just using that given that that's my current employer. So generally speaking, we have our preseason starting in September. But like I said, the first thing we want to do, again, we're going to start at that macro level, which we're doing now. The very first thing you always want to do is identify your in-season. So what is the first date of competition and what is the final date of competition? And you want to plug those things in. So in this case, it's going to be really October, let's say October 1st, and that's going to take us basically right till the end of March, April. I mean, in this year, truthfully, in the NHL actually goes a little deeper than that, but like I said, this somewhat reflects an NHL season. But let's just say for this example, our in-season runs from the start of October through the end of March. So we know that's going to be our in-season. Okay, from there, then we can plug in our postseason. And let's say we want to give our athletes maybe 1 month to get away from the sport-specific training. They're going to be in an active rest period. So we'll say the postseason then is all of April. So we have our in-season from October through March. We have a postseason at active rest happening in April. And then now we have our off-season and our training season from May, June, July, and August. And then the last thing we can plug in there is our preseason, which, like I said, is going to be anywhere from 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 8 weeks. In this case, it's 4. So we have a 1 month long preseason. So there you go. So we have our 4 seasons plugged into our macro cycle. And now it becomes pretty easy because we can say, okay, well, in October, November, December, January, February, and March, we're going to be in our in-season. We're going to be practicing a lot. All of the training we're going to be doing is going to be very sport specific. So likely we're going to have less time to do physical preparation, mental preparation, nutrition, all those other good things that we can spend a lot of time doing in the off season. So already that's going to help kind of guide what you're going to be doing in the in-season. Okay, so again, that is step 1. Identify your seasons within the training year. And you can see that for the in-season, like I said, very easy. That's your competition period, October through March. Your postseason is your active rest. Your off training season and your preseason make up when all of your training and development is going to happen. And like I said, the only difference between your preseason and your off season or your training season is that the training you're going to be doing is very sport specific, and likely you're now going to actually be in the pool. If we're talking about swimming here, we're actually going to be in the pool doing some level of sport specific training actually in the pool. Whereas in your off season and your training season, you may be doing a little bit, but certainly not to the level that you will be experiencing in the in-season. So the idea in your preseason is you're going to be doing sport-specific training at the volume that you're going to be experiencing within your in-season. That's really the idea. Is you're going to prepare all off-season to build up that volume and that intensity so you're ready. The preseason, it's kind of like a little mock season if you want to consider it that way. And then you actually do start your in-season in your in-season period, which makes a ton of sense. Okay, so like I said, the preseason really is sport-specific. You're going to be focusing on really high intensity work with relatively low volume, because again, you don't want to be burning out athletes before the in-season even starts. So again, I'll talk about how that progression happens in a moment. And the next step, like I said, then is once we've got all of our in-seasons, so we've got our macro cycle planned, we've got all of our seasons, our in, our pre, our off, and our post, we know when those are going to be. Now we can start to say, okay, well, we know what's happening in April, it's an active rest period, so what's going to happen in May? And now we can start to plan each of our mesocycles. And that's really the step you need to take. Start macro, and then you start looking at your off season and say, well, I know what I need to accomplish in my in-season, and now how am I going to get there? How am I going to get from A to B over the course of these 5 or 6 months? Okay, so we have to consider, okay, May, they've just had a month off. So what are we going to do to very gradually reintroduce them back into formal training? And often that can be a really critical step. A lot of coaches will dive into some serious training right off the gate. And what ends up happening is their athletes get hurt, or they get a little bit mentally drained. And it's simply because you're progressing them too quickly. So again, if an athlete has had a month off, be careful about easing them in. The early start of your off season really needs to be low intensity with a gradual buildup in volume. And once you've attained the volume you want, then you can start to shift into more intense work. And that's generally the approach with periodization, is you start with high volume, you build to high volume, and then you gradually reduce the volume throughout the off season into the preseason, and then you start to build up your intensity. So really they have a bit of an inverse relationship where you start high volume and low intensity, and really you just see a shift as you progress from your off season into your preseason and your in season. So that's kind of the traditional approach. So what are the features of a traditional model of periodization? Now I'm going to present to you several different models. And again, I'm going to add a twist to that when we start talking about daily monitoring. But in traditional models, what you're going to see is that there are well-defined seasons. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that. But in the previous example that we just talked about, you can see here, there are pretty well-defined seasons. The in-season is kind of 6 consecutive months, pretty easy to understand. Post-season is in April, off-season is May through August. We have 4 months there. And then we have a one month preseason. So that would be really a feature of a traditional periodization model, is these well-defined seasons. In traditional periodization models, we're going to progress from high volume in the start of your off season to eventually getting into lower volumes, and then having that inverse relationship where we're starting with low intensity and gradually building into high intensity towards the end of the in-season, or the off-season, excuse me. This is a really key one, is physical attributes. So all of your physical attributes, whether it's your cardio, your speed, your strength, power, endurance, whatever, agility, all of those different things are typically going to be trained at the same time. They're going to be trained simultaneously. So in a really traditional periodization model, that's generally what you're going to see is you're going to throw everything in a hat. You're going to try to train all of those different things at once. And lastly, generally when we're talking about mesocycles, we're going to see those variations in the volume and the intensity. Those are going to happen from mesocycle to mesocycle. So those are going to happen from training block to training block. And again, they're going to happen every roughly 4 to 6 weeks. And very quickly, I'm going to explain why that is in just a sec. So there are 3 kind of major models that are really, really common in the literature and common in practice here. We're going to talk about the last 2 later on, but just highlight that first one. In parallel training models, you're going to train all factors simultaneously within 1 microcycle. So just like I was saying here, when we're talking about traditional models of periodization, a key feature is that all physical attributes, speed, strength, agility, power, speed, all of those things, we're going to train them all at the same time. And so that would be called a parallel training model, meaning we're training all of our athletic abilities or all of our physiological factors, we're training them all in parallel with one another, meaning we're doing them all at the exact same time. So that would simply be called a parallel training model. And I'm going to talk to you about kind of the upgraded models in just a moment. Okay, so I've said this a few times now. Why do we keep our mesocycles or our training blocks to 4 to 6 weeks? Well, there are really 3 key reasons why. The first one is if you do the same thing for too long, so let's say you're doing the exact same volume, exact same intensity, same exercises, same drill work. If you do that for too long, you've all experienced this before, I'm sure, you eventually reach a plateau. So basically, you're getting a reduction in the sensitivity of that stimulus. So you're plateauing, so something needs to change. And generally speaking, we want that to occur every 4 to 6 weeks. That's typically when we start to see those plateaus happening. But we also need to make sure that we allow enough time for the adaptation to take place. So here's a simple example. So let's say I want to get really big and muscular, and I'm going to start lifting some serious weights. Okay, now let's say I do that for 2 weeks. So I start lifting weights for 2 weeks. Probably that's not enough time for me to actually get in any muscle mass. It's going to take a little bit longer than that. And so specific to muscle hypertrophy, just as an example, so muscle hypertrophy simply means growing your muscles and making them bigger. So if I want to make my muscles bigger, the literature shows it's going to take about 16 workouts or about 6 weeks for that to actually happen. So just one example there where you can see roughly in that 4 to 6 week range is when it actually takes enough time to get the adaptation that we were hoping. So again, that's another reason. You got to have enough time for the adaptation to take place. And then the third reason is we want it to be long enough that we're going to cause a state of fatigue for our athletes. So we definitely do want them to be tired. We want them to slightly overreach, but we need those mesocycles or those training blocks to be short enough so that we don't overtrain them. So if you're putting your athletes through a really tough mesocycle, a really difficult training block, again, we want it to be long enough so that we are going to cause some fatigue because that's how adaptation happens. And I'll explain that in just a sec. But we also need to make sure it's short enough that we're not bagging our athletes so badly that they're going to be overtrained and they're going to get burnt out or hurt or sick. So it's a bit of a sweet spot. And again, we kind of find that 4 to 6 weeks tends to be where that sweet spot can happen, where you can really push an athlete pretty hard. And just know the harder you push your athlete, so the more intense the training sessions are, the shorter your training block needs to be. So if you're going to be sort of in that moderate intensity, moderate volume, yeah, you can probably push it to 6 weeks. If you're going to be really high intensity and really high volume, then you really need to be closer to that 4-week mark because they're going to burn out just that much quicker. So it really is relational to how much volume and how much intensity you're putting into it. Okay, so that's generally why when we talk about your training blocks, try to stick to 4, 5, or 6 weeks. And again, that's largely based on the amount of volume and the amount of intensity relative to what they had been doing that you decide to do. Okay, so here's a really simple example. I'll explain this way. And this could be true for swimming, running, weightlifting, whatever you want. So in a linear periodization model, so linear, I mean, all periodization is linear. So that's kind of a silly term. So let's say in a traditional model of periodization, here's what it typically would look like. let's say we have we have 12 weeks of training laid out here. So 3 different training blocks. So you can see meso number 1 is going to take us from weeks 1 to 4. We have meso cycle number 2, or training block number 2, where we're going to go from weeks 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then we have meso cycle 3, where we're going to train from weeks 9, 10, 11, and 12. And what we can see here is in meso cycle 1, so in that first training block, we're going to do 3 sets of 8 reps. Okay, and let's just say 1 rep is like a 50-meter swim. I don't know, just something to say. So let's say each rep is a 50-meter swim. So we're going to do 3 sets of 8 50s. Okay, and you're going to have some rest periods between each of those 50s, of course, but just so you get a sense of what the volume is, you're going to do 24 50-meter swims. Okay. In mesocycle 2, you're going to do 3 sets of 6. And then in mesocycle 3, you're going to do 3 sets of 4. And so what's happening here is your volume, you can see your volume decreases over time. So we're going from 24 reps to 18 reps to 12 reps. So we're seeing the volume decrease from training block to training block. Like I said, that's typical in an off season. What we're going to see then is as your volume goes down, your intensity should be able to increase. And so this is really simple to understand in the weight room, where if my maximum bench press, let's say I'm lying down, I'm going to max out the most I can do one time. Let's say it's 250 pounds. It's not, I'm far weaker than that, I promise you, but let's pretend it is. Let's say it's 250 pounds. If I can only do that one time, what I'm going to do is in mesocycle 1, I'm going to pick a weight that I can lift 8 times. So it's going to be relatively a lot lighter than what I can do only one time, right? So let's say it's 150 pounds. Let's say I can do 150 pounds on the bench press 8 times. Now in mesocycle 2, I'm going to drop my intensity down, meaning I only have to lift the weight 6 times now instead of 8, so I can lift a heavier weight. So my intensity is going to go up. So maybe I can do 200 pounds. Okay, and then as I go into mesocycle 3 or training block 3, now I'm only having to lift the weight 4 times. So again, I can work a little bit at a higher intensity. So maybe I can do 225 pounds. Okay, so what we see again is our volume is going down from training block to training block as we progress through our off season. Our intensity now is going up because of that inverse relationship that exists between intensity and volume. And what we're seeing here is variation occurring every 4 weeks. Okay, so it fits well within that 4 to 6 week structure that we laid out for our mesocycles. So this would be a really traditional, very simple example of periodization, and it works perfectly well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this model at all. Many people still do it. This, again, is called really that parallel training model if we were to be training all of our specific factors at the same time. So speed, strength, muscular endurance, everything. If we were throwing it all in the hat and doing it all the same way, that would be a parallel training structure. But this is a really kind of simple example of how to progress from mesocycle to mesocycle. Okay, and an example of this kind of a traditional model working really well is if anyone watches football here, or the NFL season starts, this is a really simple sport to plan for because their season is relatively short. So if we look at their in-season, it really only runs from mid-September to mid-January. Okay, and that's if you make the playoffs. For most teams, or for about half the teams in the league, they don't even go that long. So their season is relatively short. It's only about a 4-month season. Okay, following that, you can give them a 1 month off season, let's say, and then they have 6 months to train, which is largely why, if you ever watched like the NFL scouting combine or seen NFL athletes, they're really some of the most impressive athletes in the world. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's because they have nearly half of a year, every single year, to train for their physical preparation. And then on top of that, in their in-season, they only have 1 competition per week. So even in their in-season, they can actually continue to train pretty seriously. Now, for you as swimmers, that's not the case. Your training schedule is pretty busy. Your competition schedule can be quite busy. You spend a lot of time in the pool. So it's not as clear-cut for swimming as it is for football. But this would be an example where a traditional model works very well. You can start with high volume, low intensity. You can shift it gradually over the off season and work your way. Even in your in-season, you can still continue to train. Okay, so where does traditional periodization not work very well? Well, I'll give you an example from when I was working at Cirque du Soleil. Most of our artists would do more than 350 shows per year. So think about that. There are 365 days in a year, and we're asking the performers to perform 350 shows in a year. So they're training, or they're performing basically every day. And if they're not performing, they're training. And virtually every single day they're doing 2-a-days. So they're either training and performing, or they're even performing twice on a day. And in some shows, they're even asked to perform 3 shows in a day. So their training schedules are about as difficult as you're ever going to experience. And they really have no off season. This happens all year round, pretty much. I think the longest break they typically get is 2 days off, and then they go again. So it's a pretty arduous training schedule. So you can imagine that a traditional model doesn't really work, right? So when is their in season? When is their off season? When is their post season? You know, that sort of nomenclature, that traditional model just doesn't work, because there really is no off season. It's really a constant state of in season training. So it doesn't work typically very well. Traditional periodization also doesn't work generally very well when you have multi-sport athletes with competing seasons. So if I am let's say I'm a 15-year-old hockey player who also does speed skating, who also does indoor soccer, you know, I'm going to be playing 3 sports at the same time. So again, when are you planning? And then maybe you do baseball in the summer and outdoor soccer in the summer. So again, when is your in season? Well, your in season technically for each sport is going to carry you through a constant state of in season. So again, it doesn't really work very well either. And then in individual sports with frequent competitions, you know, I've done a lot of work with Wrestling Canada, with their Olympians, and they compete basically all year round in really kind of an unplanned schedule. It can kind of change year to year. You never quite know. You can have maybe 1 month off, and then next month you're competing, another month off, the next month you're competing. So again, it's not really a clear-cut in-season, off-season, post-season, pre-season. Again, you're kind of constantly changing these things. So traditional periodization models are really difficult to do. Your best bet, if you have kind of in practice, generally speaking, you can create kind of the maximum of 3 macro cycles within a training year. Anything beyond that becomes really tough. And so again, if you have 350 shows in a year, you're in a constant state of in-season. It doesn't really work. If you're a multi-sport athlete who plays 5 or 6 different sports, it's going to be impossible for you to periodize all of those different things. If you're an individual sport athlete who's constantly competing, same thing, it becomes really, really difficult. So that's why when we're talking today, what I really want to stress is the importance of daily monitoring, because you can still apply some of the principles that we've learned from traditional periodization, but what ends up happening is you need to really understand what's happening with your athlete on a day-to-day basis. And so we're going to talk about that in a lot of detail in a moment. Okay, just so you know, it's kind of some of the alternative models that have come up, or kind of variations of traditional periodization. There's one called reverse periodization, which actually is kind of popular in endurance sports. So, you know, swimming certainly would classify, unless you're talking about just pure sprints here. But basically what you do is, instead of starting with high volume, low intensity, and then progressing to high intensity, low volume, you're actually going to do the opposite. So in reverse periodization is basically at the start of their off season, you're going to start with high intensity and low volume, and then you're going to shift into high volume, low intensity. So it's really just the reverse. To be honest, the research in it shows that it's not really effective in most sports. In some endurance-based sports, it seems to be as good as traditional. So the argument then would be, well, if at its very best it can be as good as traditional, why wouldn't you just do traditional? So doesn't really appear to be the way to go. So I would kind of steer you away from reverse periodization. If, for example, you've experimented with it and you find that it's fantastic for your athletes, and great. But again, I'm speaking in general terms here. Generally speaking, hasn't really been proven to be super effective. Okay, so here's another example. This is called weekly undulating periodization. And this is simply just another way to really accomplish the same thing, but you're just kind of mixing up your microcycles within a specific mesocycle. So in other words, how you structure each week within a training block or a training month. So remember, in the traditional model, we had 3 sets of 8 for weeks 1 to 4, 3 sets of 6 for weeks 5 to 8, and then 3 sets of 4 for weeks 6 through 9, or 9 through 12, whatever it was. I can't quite recall, but you get the idea. In weekly undulating, rather than only shifting your training intensities and volumes from mesocycle to mesocycle, you're actually going to do it week to week, so by microcycle. So in this example, you can see in weeks 1, 4, and 7, we're going to be doing 3 sets of 8. In weeks 2, 5, and 8, we're going to be doing 3 sets of 6. And in weeks 3, 6, and 9, we're going to be doing 3 sets of 4. So if we were to extend each of these out by just another week each and compare it to that first model I explained to you, really your overall training volume and your overall intensity over the course of the 12 weeks is actually identical. It's just how you're shifting from week to week is different. So instead of going weeks 1 to 4 being the same volume and intensity, and then weeks 5 to 8, and then 9 through 12, now all you're doing is you're just kind of shuffling the card deck and saying, well, in weeks 1, 4, and 7, we'll do this. 2, 5, and 8 will do this. 3, 6, and 9 will do this. So really the idea there is that you're just going to get an undulation in the volume and the intensity. So say, for example, you're in your training blocks, your 3 training blocks here are all really, really intense. What you can try to do then is week to week, you can have kind of minor fluctuations in volume and intensity. So maybe you can bring the intensity down in week 2, shoot back up again in week 3, bring it back down in week 4. So just a little bit more undulation there. It might afford just a little bit more recovery to happen. And then as well, it's also nice as a mental break, so you're not doing the exact same thing for 4 weeks straight. So it can be kind of a fun way to mix that up. Okay, another very simple way to do this is just by doing it daily, so daily undulating. So maybe on Mondays, you do 3 sets of 8. On Wednesday, you do 3 sets of 6. And on Friday, you do 3 sets of 4. And again, you would do this for 9 weeks or 12 weeks, depending. So again, your overall training volume and intensity over the course of your 12 weeks or 9 weeks, whatever, is actually going to be the same, whichever model you choose here. It's basically just, are you making changes in volume and intensity from mesocycle to mesocycle? Are you doing it week to week? Or are you even doing it day to day? But again, in the grand big picture here, it's actually essentially ends up being much the same, no matter how you do it. Okay, so here are the 2 upgraded periodization models that I wanted to explain to you. So we've really talked a lot of detail about what a traditional model looks like, those well-defined sports seasons, progressing from high volume, low intensity, to high intensity, low volume, and training all factors simultaneously. And I will say this, so the parallel training model, so for all of you working with, let's say, non-elite athletes, and I don't necessarily love that term because you can be an elite athlete relative to your counterparts at a young age, but you know, I'm talking about like Olympic level, national team. When I say elite, that's kind of the level I'm talking about. If you're still working with very much developing athletes, your best bet is actually to stick with the parallel training model. It's totally okay to train everything at the same time. Totally okay. So you can do your speed training, your strength, your power, your endurance, your cardio. You can throw it all in there at once, and you can train all of those different things at once. That's totally okay. Literature supports that pretty substantially. So again, if you're working with developing athletes, it's totally appropriate to train everything all at once. That's okay. Now, you may focus on one skill more than another, right? You don't have to do everything totally equally, but it's, you know, you can do speed training at the same time you're doing cardio. But if your sport is more cardio driven, maybe you're going to focus a little bit more on cardio. Okay, fair enough. But the idea is it's okay to train everything all at once. Now, when you get into more elite level of athletes, so athletes who are closer to hitting their genetic limit for potential, it becomes really, really difficult to make further improvements. So a simple example is this. Let's say you're lucky enough to be the coach for LeBron James, you're a basketball coach, you're working with LeBron James. To try to make LeBron James jump higher, you know, he's probably pretty darn close to his genetic limit already. He's probably can jump as high as he's ever going to jump. You're probably going to have a very difficult time making any sort of change with that, especially if you're focusing on 50 different athletic abilities at the same time. So basically, when you're working with really elite level athletes who are close to their genetic potential, what you need to do is have almost a singular focus. So I'm going to focus on one thing at a time. I'm going to dedicate a boatload of volume, a boatload of intensity to that one thing, and we're going to try to make an improvement in that. And the best you can hope for is to try to maintain or even limit the amount of detraining that happens in all of those other abilities. Okay? I hope that makes sense with everybody. So again, if you're working with an elite level athlete, you want to be almost singularly focused. You want to focus on one thing. Whereas if you're working with a developing athlete, you know, they don't need a huge amount of volume to improve, so you can do everything all at once. And so think of it this way. You know, let's say if anyone here has ever gone on like a weight loss program, or maybe they've just started lifting weights, it's pretty amazing when you first start trying to lose weight, or if you first start trying to get strong, the first few weeks you do it, you're like, wow, this is a piece of cake. You know, I've dropped 5 pounds in the first month, you know, or I've gained 15 pounds in my bench press. Basically, because you've got so much room to grow, that adaptations or that improvements can happen really, really quickly. So it doesn't take much volume or intensity to make these improvements. But again, as you get closer to your limit, to your absolute max potential, it's going to take more dedicated training, more volume, more intensity. So what we tend to do with higher level athletes, so, you know, as you get into more like NCAA, CIS, even into national team, maybe international teams, professional teams, we want to focus on really these other 2 models. And so they're called sequential training models, or you've probably heard the term block periodization or block training before. So that's what this is. So what you're going to do in a block model or sequential model is you're going to be training a limited number of factors per microcycle. So every week or even every mesocycle, let's say, you're going to be focusing on kind of 1 or 2, maybe 3 things. So let's say, and those 3 things you focus on should really kind of work well together. So let's say I want to improve my maximum strength, my speed, and my power. Those would be 3 things that go hand in hand very well together. They are going to actually help one another. If you get stronger, you're going to get more powerful, and you're probably going to get a little bit faster. Okay, so those tend to work very well together. So you're going to focus on a limited number of factors and factors that are sort of related to one another. And the reason for that is we want to allow for higher training loads and intensities than if we were to throw everything in the blender and doing it all at once. But the caveat with that is you're going to have to allow some of your other factors to slightly detrain here. Now, let's say I was doing a 6-week training block where I wanted to really focus on my speed and strength. Let's say those were the 2 things I really wanted to focus on. I'm working with an elite athlete who I think would really stand to improve if they got better with their strength and their speed. So I'm going to put them on a dedicated 6-week program, and maybe it's going to be multiple 6-week blocks. But let's just say 6 weeks from now, a dedicated block for speed and strength. Now, what I can do is, instead of just saying, man, I'm not going to do any cardio, I'm not going to do any agility, I'm not going to do any of that kind of stuff, what I can do is I can sprinkle in maybe 1 or 2 workouts here and there just to try to really limit the amount of detraining that happens. Okay? So in a parallel model, what we would do is we would do agility, speed, strength, power, muscular endurance. You know, we'd kind of be doing everything at almost the same volume and intensity. Again, we might focus on 1 or 2 things, but, you know, we kind of be doing everything roughly the same. In a block periodization model, we're going to really focus on 1 or 2, maybe 3 things. And we're going to push a lot of volume and a lot of intensity. And then for all of those other factors, you know, we might sprinkle in a little bit here just to try to maintain those abilities and hopefully try to limit some detraining. Okay. In a classic block model, though, you're really just pushing 1 or 2 abilities and almost singularly focusing on that. Now, the emphasis training model or the pendulum model, it's kind of a combination of both of those things. So you're going to work kind of everything all at once, but you're going to have 3 distinct groups within that. You're going to have a stimulating group, which are the specific factors that you really want to focus on. So in my example, let's say it's strength and speed. I'm going to have some of my factors are going to be in maintenance mode where, you know, I'm going to do a moderate level of volume and intensity with them. And then I'm going to have other factors that are in detraining mode. So maybe those are my, you know, the ones that are really good and I'm not terribly worried about it, or they're just not, more likely they're just not super relevant to my sport. You know, those are the ones that I would probably allow to detrain. And basically, as a practitioner, what you would do is you would just prioritize the volume and intensity with those things. So the factors that are in the stimulating group, you would say, we're going to put a lot of volume, a lot of intensity. We're going to spend a lot of time working on that. The maintenance group would kind of be your tier 2 ones. Say, well, these are, you know, these are relevant. You know, my athlete's pretty darn good at these already, probably not a ton of room to improve. So let's maintain those. So maybe we would hit that with some moderate volume, sprinkle in some high intensity stuff there to maintain it. And then for some that are maybe not super relevant, so if I'm like in a power, strength, speed sport, like let's say baseball, you know, I don't really need cardio. So maybe I'll just let my cardio detrain. I'm not going to do any cardio training, and that would be okay. Okay, so that's kind of your 3 different approaches. In parallel training models, you're kind of throwing everything in the blender, doing all roughly the same. In the block periodization model, you're really focusing on like 1 or 2 things, and you're almost forgetting about everything else. And in the pendulum model, you're kind of, you know, you're prioritizing. You're doing everything at once, but they're going to be prioritized in stimulating, maintenance, and detraining. So I would argue that the one that probably works best, well, again, I shouldn't even say that. Depending on the situation, they can both be appropriate. Again, with really, really, really elite people, if you're trying to improve factors that are already pretty darn close to their genetic limit, you're probably going to have to go into a block periodization model. And the reason for that is because they have so many other things to train in terms of their sport-specific training. Again, like let's say we're working with LeBron James during the season and we want to try to make his jump a little bit higher. I mean, they're competing 4 times a week. They're practicing. He has mental preparation sessions to do, recovery sessions to do. You're going to have a very limited time to do that. So you better just focus on one thing. We're going to only try to work on that vertical jump. That's it. And everything else, we're just going to say, well, hopefully basketball will maintain that and we'll go from there. And then in the pendulum model, it's kind of a nice mix between the two, where you can maintain more abilities, you can focus on some abilities, but you're getting a nice kind of balance between all 3 of those things. So again, it's up to you as a practitioner to determine, which of these approaches is best or most appropriate for your athlete and specific to the level that you're working at. Maybe just give me some head nods if this is all kind of registering and making sense. Yeah? Okay, and again, feel free, towards the end, we're gonna have plenty of time here, so fire away with questions. Okay, so the major limitations. So with all of the models we've just talked about, whether it's parallel, sequential, pendulum, whatever, daily undulating, weekly undulating, traditional linear, all these different approaches, the biggest weakness of all of them is that they are not sensitive to daily changes in athletes' performance, mood, motivation, fatigue, soreness, you name it. Okay, there's absolutely no sensitivity to that. And the reason is, remember that one of the first slides I showed you, that chart with all the crazy numbers that, again, you've probably all had to fill out before? If I say, okay, Penny, I'm going to develop your training program for the year, Penny. I'm going to train you for a marathon. We're going to try to reduce your time by like 40 minutes. We're January 1st. Here's your plan. Okay, probably by September, things in your life are going to be really different. But I'm going to be like, Penny, hey, tough beans. I made the program in January. You're sticking to it. I mean, that just doesn't work. Life changes. It happens all the time. Schedules change. So really, you need to be sensitive to what's going on in the athlete's life, what's going on in the world. I mean, look at COVID, for crying out loud. I mean, that has changed everything. So, you need to be adaptable. You need to be flexible. And the problem with traditional periodization, those kind of pre-planned models, is that they just can't be sensitive to what's going on. So we need something more than that. We need to learn how can we be sensitive to what's going on with our athletes on a daily basis. And that really brings us to part 2. And I really cannot stress this enough. For me, this is actually far more important than periodization. It's understanding, how am I going to monitor my athletes on a daily basis and make changes to their daily programs? Now, with that said, it's obviously critically important that you have a plan. I'm certainly not recommending that you don't plan anything. Certainly, you do want to have a skeleton of what your year is going to look like. You want to go through your 4 seasons. You want to know what's going to happen. You definitely want to do that, but it should be done in pencil, not pen. Daily monitoring then allows you to pull out your eraser, make changes, and adapt. And so we're going to talk about that. So really a comprehensive athlete management strategy. So for me as a sports scientist, this is really what I'm responsible for largely when I'm working with athletes is, I do all of their evaluations and screening. So, I work with our medical doctors and our physiotherapists and stuff. We do a musculoskeletal scene, we do blood screening. I certainly do their fitness assessments. They, will see a nutritionist for a nutritional screen. They'll see a mental health professional for their mental health screen. So we do all those evaluations, tests, screens at the beginning. That's kind of part 1. Part 2 is that athlete monitoring protocol. So what are we going to do to monitor our daily performance of our athletes? And then part 3 is, what are we going to do with all this data and how are we going to actually make decisions? So that's kind of really the job of a sports scientist. So what I recommend to you, this is a very convoluted slide, but it's actually pretty easy to understand as I go through it here. Kind of my minimum standard, and I would really try to get all of you as coaches to try to get into the practice of doing this. We want to always have some sort of preseason evaluation. Okay, so we want to be able to do that at the beginning of our year. We want to understand, where is our athlete today? Think of it as a baseline. What's their baseline level of strength? What's their baseline level of speed? What's their technical ability like? We want to understand where they are now. And that's really what's supposed to then guide your training program, right? So from there, we also want to have a mid-season evaluation. So kind of a check-in midway through the year. And we also want to have an end of the year evaluation. So we know what's happening as a baseline. We're going to check in mid-season to say, are we actually achieving our goals? Are they getting better at the things we were planning for them to get better at? And then again, at the end of the year, we can do another check-in and say, hey, did they get better? Did we achieve our goals? And then what we find in the end of the season evaluation can guide our off-season training program, right? Now, between each of those three critical points, we want to understand what is happening on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. So that is where the daily monitoring comes into play. So we want to do that between each of our evaluation periods, is to have a comprehensive monitoring strategy. And I'll talk to you in great detail about what that needs to look like. Okay, so there are really four things that we need to monitor. Okay, and they come in four broad categories. I'll talk about the first two first. So the first one is called external workload. Okay, again, you can kind of give me a head nod if you've maybe heard that term before, external workload. It's basically asked, what did the athlete do today? Okay, typically we're going to measure this in terms of like GPS data. So, you know, in soccer, basketball, GPS is extremely popular. In hockey, we're using that now too. You know, this could be something as simple as repetition counts. So maybe in swimming, that works very well. It could be, you know, timing. It could be something as simple as the amount of time they spent doing something. We can use accelerometers. You know, in hockey, we do that. We use accelerometers, and we use something called a 3D gyroscope that we put into the athlete's shoulder pad so we can monitor all that. So this is external workload. This is what did the athlete do? So again, it can be measured in how much distance they covered, how fast did they go, how much acceleration took place. And then internal workload is what is happening within the athlete's body. So external workload is sort of what are we actually measuring, and internal workload is actually what's happening in the body of the athlete. So now this would be things that, objectively speaking, would be things like heart rate, ventilation rate, so breathing rate. It could be blood lactate concentration. So again, it's things happening within the body of the athlete. But we can also do something very subjective, and this is called RPE. I'm sure all of you have heard of this, rating of perceived exertion, RPE. And it simply says, how did the athlete perceive the difficulty of that session? So in external workload, I can tell you how much time, distance, the amount of acceleration, velocity, all those different things. I can do internal workload. I can look at their heart rate data, their breathing data. I can look at their blood markers if I want. But, you know, really simply, I could just say, hey, Penny, on a scale from 1 to 10, how hard was that session today? And, you know, you might say 1, it was super, oh, it was a 10. It was incredibly difficult. Penny had a tough day today, so it was a 10. You know, so on a scale from 1 to 10, it was a 10, really, really difficult. And actually, what's pretty cool about RPE is 1, it's simple, 2, it's free, and 3, it actually has been shown to correlate very, very well to all of these other markers of internal workload. So in swimming, for example, you might find it really hard to do underwater heart rate monitoring. Maybe you don't want to be doing blood lactate concentrations because you're going to prick their ear, make them bleed, and then put them right back in the swimming pool. Probably not the most hygienic or safe to do that. Maybe it's difficult to track breathing when they're under the water, right? It can be really tough. So when I was working with in Cirque du Soleil, the underwater show, you know, we did develop a way to do underwater heart rates and stuff, but, you know, it was tricky. And, you know, one of the easier things we did was just say, well, hey, what was, from a scale from 1 to 10, how tough was that today? And so we got a very subjective marker of internal workload. So at a very bare minimum, this is a super easy thing to do. And I'll talk you through in a bit more detail what to do there. The third one is well-being, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And the fourth one is kind of that daily readiness, fatigue. We'll touch on that. Okay, so here's a real simple example of what I did when I was at Cirque du Soleil. So at Cirque, we had a pretty comprehensive daily monitoring program. And so if you can see in the picture here, you see the guy who's standing upside down on the unicycle on a tightrope. This is called a slack line or slack wire. So it's basically a tightrope that actually like sways back and forth, and it's incredibly difficult. And anyway, this guy's on his head on a unicycle on that slack line, which is pretty remarkable. But what we would do is we would make him wear this little sports bra. And within the sports bra is, see this the 3 little units here, the 3 little disc looking things. You know, they're about the size of my palm, actually about half the size of my palm, if I'm being realistic about it. And those would just get slipped into that little sports bra. And from that, we could get heart rate data. We would get accelerometry data. So there are accelerations across 3 different planes of motion. So up, down, left, right, and rotational. We would get 3D gyroscope data, which was actually like the rotation happening across 3 dimensions. And then a magnetometer, which is basically kind of orients you in space and tells us their position in space. And so just using that little unit there in that tiny little sports bra, we would get all of that different data. So all of their training sessions we would track. I could look at all that data and I could make estimates about their workload, how to progress them safely, who's doing too much, who's doing too little. And we would compare their internal workload, so their heart rate, their breathing rates, all those different things. We would compare it to their workload and say, how is athlete A or artist A responding to a given workload compared to artist B? So if I have two artists doing the same thing, and so their external workloads are the same, meaning their accelerations are the same, the distance, time, all those external measures are the same, but artist A has a higher heart rate, has a higher sweat rate, has all the higher breathing rate, that tells you something. They're having a more difficult time responding to the same level of work. So maybe it's their fitness, or maybe they're mentally drained, or motivation, whatever, right? But it tells you something. So comparing their internal workload to their external workload is a really critical thing to do as a sports scientist. On top of that, we would also do well-being questionnaires. So we would have them do a daily questionnaire, and I'll give you an example of that in just a sec. We would do physiological readiness assessments. So we would have them jump on force plates every single day as well. And so I would look at their force plate data to say, how does it compare to a week ago? How does it compare to yesterday? Are they showing a trend of fatigue? Are they showing a trend of improvement? Is their motor programming changing? Meaning, are they compensating? Or maybe they're producing the same level of force output, but how they're achieving that has changed. So their mechanics have changed. All of that data, I use all of that data to make decisions about, should they train more? Should they train less? Are they overreaching? Are they overtraining? Do we think they're in line for illness or injury? Are they performing optimally and ready for performance? We use all of that data to make those types of decisions. Okay, so let's talk about RPE, because it's a really simple one. Again, if you don't have access to a bunch of fancy equipment like I did at Cirque and like I do with the New Jersey Devils, I'm very fortunate to have all that stuff, but you don't necessarily need it. You can do something really simple, and that is an internal workload measure. It's a subjective measure of internal workload called RPE. And all you would have to do is you can show your athletes this little chart here, or hold up 10 fingers, whatever you want to do. And you just say, hey, on a scale from 1 to 10, after every single training session you do, so whether it's in the pool, in the weight room, mental preparation, whatever, I would really encourage you to start doing this if you're not already. And the nice thing about this is you can implement it at any age. This is a great way to start introducing sports science to young athletes, because it's so simple. Say, hey, Billy, on a scale from 1 to 10, how hard was that swim today? Maybe it was a 3. Okay, great. Maybe it was a 10. Okay, but again, that's going to tell you something. And what we want to do with that is you're going to take their RPE, so whatever number they told you, and you're going to simply multiply it by the duration of the training session. And that's going to give you something called session RPE, session rating of perceived exertion. This is a super common way to measure internal workload. We do it with the Devils, we did it at Cirque. So even on top of all those fancy gadgets that we have, we still do this as well, because they correlate very closely. So you would take, to get your SRPE, you would just take the time. So let's say you did a 60-minute swim, and Johnny says, hey, that was a 4 out of 10. So you take 60, you multiply it by 4, you get 240. Okay, so that would be the session RPE. So the training load for that session would be 240. Okay, so in a practical example, here's an actual example from Cirque. This is how we would structure their program. So basically at Cirque du Soleil, what I would do is I would sit down with their coaches, and for every single training session that they did, we would assign a duration, and we would pre-plan an RPE. So we would say, we want this to be a 90-minute acro session, acrobatics, and we want that 90-minute session to be perceived at a 7 out of 10. So kind of, moderate to high intensity. And then for their artistic session, maybe a 3, maybe for their afternoon acro session, maybe a 6, and then for their strength conditioning, maybe a 4. And so again, for each of those sessions, we could get an SRPE. We would just say 7 multiplied by 90, 3 multiplied by 60, 6 multiplied by 90, 4 multiplied by 60. And then at the end of every day, we could get a daily training load, really simple. And then you can just compare day to day, are we fluctuating daily? Are we doing all those things? And so really the power of that, there's a couple of very useful things you can do. So here's just the math there. So session 1 was 90 by 7, session 2 was 60 by 3, 90 by 6, 60 by 4. And like I said, you get a daily training load. And that becomes a really useful number, because then again, you can compare it day to day, week to week, all those different things. And you can really ask 2 critical questions. Is how do the athlete's perception of training compare to what I had planned? So let's say that first session on a Monday morning, we want it to be intense because they've just had a day off perhaps on a Sunday, but we don't want it to be so intense that they're going to get hurt because they just had a day off. So, maybe moderate to high is not so bad, 90 minutes. So let's say I planned for a 7, but they came in and said, man, that was a 10. That was a 10 out of 10. That was so difficult. That was crazy. So now I know as a coach, what I had planned wasn't appropriate because either the athletes just aren't in shape or weren't prepared for it or whatever. Maybe it was my mistake, maybe it was theirs. But the whole point is there was a misalignment between what I had planned and how the athletes actually perceive that. So again, that's useful information. That's going to tell you something. And the other one is there's something called the acute to chronic workload ratio. And it's kind of been touted as being able to predict injuries, and the literature does not support that. It really doesn't. But the acute to chronic workload ratio basically says, what am I doing acutely, meaning what am I doing today versus what I was doing kind of over the previous 7 days? And basically, it's just a reminder to say, so you would basically compare your daily training load. So let's say today we did a 1,590. And then I would take my 7-day average, the previous 7 days, I would average those previous 7 days, and maybe they averaged 1,500. So I'd say, okay, great. If I compare acutely to my acute to my chronic workload, I would say, yeah, probably what I'm doing is appropriate. It's a pretty minor jump in their training volume. That's pretty good. But what if your daily training load was 1,590, and then you did the average of the previous 7 days, and it was 500? Okay, well, now you've gone from the athlete being used to doing a 500 day, and now you've jumped them up to almost 1,600. So that's a signal to you as a coach to say, hey, you know what? I probably blew that. I made a big jump in their volume or their intensity there. Something's got to give. I need to be better at that. And it's a nice little reminder to bring it down. Again, we want gradual progressions from mesocycle to mesocycle, right? We don't want these big jumps because that's typically when we see someone get sick or someone get hurt or somebody get mentally burnt out. Generally speaking, it happens for one of two reasons. We either do too much or too intensely too soon, or we just carry too much volume, too intensity for too long. Okay, so we either push too hard or we push too long. Those are typically the two things that we do. So the acute to chronic workload ratio is a kind of a really nice, simple reminder to say, hey, what have we been doing recently? And that should somewhat line up with what we're doing now. Now, you can certainly have, improvements and jumps, but we just don't want those big drastic jumps. Okay, so again, SRPE, really a simple tool that you can use at all levels of sport and all levels of development. It's a great tool. Okay, so the last two monitoring tools then are well-being and readiness. So here's a simple example of a questionnaire that we would do at CERC. So every athlete had access to an app we used Coach Me Plus, was our athlete management system. And so we could upload these questionnaires and we'd say, there was, I think, 6 questions, as an example, the first one here. So last night, your sleep was restful, satisfying, and relaxing. You're going to rate that from 1 to 5. A 1 meaning it was terrible, a 5 meaning it was fantastic sleep, okay? And the athlete would just click a number and they would go down. And so we would ask questions about their sleep. We would ask questions about their muscle soreness, about their mood. Maybe you could ask questions about their stress or anxiety, maybe how tired they feel. You can kind of pick and choose whatever you want, but those are kind of the common ones like sleep and muscle soreness and fatigue. And so you could just ask really simple questions about that, have them fill out the survey every day. And then again, you're looking for trends here. If, Johnny typically reports that he's sleeping well, he's in a great mood, and then all of a sudden he starts saying, man, I'm sleeping terribly, I'm in a bad mood, I have low energy. Again, that's probably a pretty clear sign that this kid is approaching overtraining. So you as a coach need to back off. And again, these questionnaires are awesome because it's a great way to start a conversation with your athlete and say, hey, I was looking at your data, you're not sleeping so hot anymore, your mood's kind of changing, hey, what's going on? And then the athlete might tell you that, hey, I'm having some trouble at home, or my job is really stressful, or whatever, right? But again, it opens a dialogue. And as coaches, that's really what we want. We want a connection with our athletes. And this is a great way to reconnect and to start those really important conversations. Okay, and the last one is daily readiness. So I gave you an example at CERC where we would have all the artists, jump on a force plate. So they would do 4 maximal vertical jumps on a force plate. And we would look at that data. You could do like a 10-meter sprint and look at their 10-meter sprint time. You could do like a 10-meter swim and just look at their split time over 10 meters and see how that's changing every day. So that would be a physical performance test. You could do that. You could look at like heart rate measurements, like heart rate variability, which is honestly, in practice, incredibly difficult to do. You could look at like resting heart rate or submaximal heart rates. You can look at biochemical like saliva tests and blood tests. You probably don't want to do that. The most common one generally is a performance test. So like, you could do something as simple like a triple broad jump. What's the distance they cover on a triple broad jump? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? If it's getting worse, maybe that's a sign that they're overtraining a bit. A really simple one in the pool might be, like I said, a 5 meter or 10 meter split. So you have them, swim as fast as they possibly can for 5 or 10 meters, track that every single day. Just do it basically as part of their warm up. And then you would say, okay, hey, all of a sudden, M, your 5 meter sprint time in the pool has gone down. Or gone up? What's going on here? Are you partying every night, or what's going on here? So, you start to have those types of questions too. And then again, you can start a dialogue with your athlete and say, hey, are you overtired? Is it you're not sleeping well? You got a lot of stress going on in your life? And again, you can always refer back to your external workload data, your internal workload data, and maybe start to get some answers to the questions you now have, right? So again, you really want something out of each of these 4 categories, out of internal, external, wellness, and readiness. So, try to find one simple thing you can do in each of those things. It might be as simple as, for external workload, you're just going to count the number of sets and reps they're going to do, or the amount of distance. Here's an even simpler one: the total distance they cover in a session. Really simple. For the internal workload, you use RPE. For the wellness, maybe you have one question every day. They come and you say, hey, Em, what's your energy from 1 to 10 today? Em says, hey, it's an 8. I feel great. Okay, perfect. That's super easy to do. And number 4, for physical readiness, maybe you do a 5 meter split in the pool, and you can do that every day at the end of their warm up. You do a quick timing session, away you go. It takes 10 minutes to rifle through everybody. But all of this stuff can be really simple, and it gives you an immense amount of data that you can then use to start really important conversations with your athletes. So I'd really recommend that. Again, as you get higher up in your development and working with more elite, older athletes, you've got more resources, more staff, you can start doing all the fun stuff with gyroscopes and accelerometers and all that cool stuff. But, it doesn't need to be that complicated. It doesn't need to be that tech savvy. Okay, part 3. And I promise we're almost done here. Part 3, basically flexible periodization, is basically taking traditional models. So, developing that plan in pencil, like I said, you definitely do need to plan. You want that skeleton plan. It can be done in pencil, and then you're going to combine that daily monitoring. So basically the difference here is it builds some flexibility into the program, and it takes into account those daily changes. Basically, you're going to use the data to make smart decisions every day. That's basically what flexible periodization is. So here's an example. Let's say that my original plan was, week 1, we were going to do 4 power sessions. Let's say we're in a real strict block periodization here, where we wanted to do 4 power sessions every week, or largely every week. Let's look at week 1. But let's say by the time we get to Friday, I've done Emma's 5 meter sprint, or excuse me, Em's 5 meter sprint. Her time has gone up. Her sleep was terrible last night. She's come in and said, she doesn't have a lot of energy. Her acute to chronic workload ratio maybe is a little bit higher than I thought it should be. So maybe on Friday I say, what? Today's not a power day. She's not going to have the energy to do this. Let's just do an endurance. Let's bring the intensity way down. Let's do a real basic endurance session. So that is really what flexible periodization is all about. How can you take your big picture traditional model, but also build in some of these daily monitoring strategies to make smart decisions? If you were to say, what, Em, tough S word, you're going to have to do, you're going to do a power session today. You're going to do it next Monday. You're going to do it next Tuesday. You're going to do it Thursday, Friday. You're going to do what I had planned because it's in pen and I don't have an eraser for pen. Tough beans, you're doing it. I mean, by the end of that block, there's a very likely chance she's going to be mentally burnt out. She might get sick. She might get hurt. She might just start to check out of your program. It's all of these different things that, maybe as a former athlete you've encountered or you've seen in practice. So again, as practitioners, we've got to be sensitive to what's going on inside our athletes. It's just critically important. The other thing that I haven't yet touched on, but I want to stress, is the final week of every single mesocycle. So the final week of every single week, or the final week of every training block, needs to be what's called a deload week. So you need to bring your volume way down and your intensity way down. So the idea is you're going to build from weeks 1, 2, 3, if we're doing a 4-week block, but the final week of every single training block needs to be a recovery week. And that is how you prevent the accumulation of fatigue, right? So we're going to transition from block to block, but that has to happen with the final week of every block as a recovery week. So we can go hard for 3, and the 4th one needs to be easy. Or maybe it's a 6-week block where we can go hard for 5, and that 6th week needs to be really easy. Okay, and the idea there is, again, the way physiology works, very simply, is you're going to present the body with a stimulus that's bigger or better or something different than the body has experienced before. It's going to be big enough to cause a state of fatigue. Once the athlete's performance dips a little bit, which it should, we want it to dip. We're going to hit them with appropriate recovery, so that deload week. We're going to get what's called a super compensatory rebound. So your physiology is going to adjust and say, hey, I'm not used to doing this. We got to build more muscle mass, or we got to build more mitochondria. We got to do something here to make my system be able to tolerate this. And if we allow enough recovery, that's exactly what happens. Your body comes up with the plan to say, let's do this. And then your baseline goes up. And then you scaffold and say, okay, now we need to hit the body again with a bigger, better stimulus. We're going to cause fatigue. And then it keeps going. And we just keep layering on. But the key point there is, if you hit them with a stimulus and cause fatigue, you got to hit them with recovery to get that super compensation. If you don't, so if you're constantly skipping out on those deload weeks, all you're going to do is take it from here, and eventually you're just going to drive them into the dirt. And it happens all the time. I see professional coaches do this, who get paid millions of dollars. And this is really a fundamental thing. So if you aren't already doing this, I would strongly encourage you to do it. And the cool thing about this is it just allows you to push harder in those other weeks. So if you're only doing a 4-week block, you can push really hard for 3 weeks. They can handle that. Only if your 4th week is low volume, low intensity, hit them with good recovery. Okay. All right. So the benefits of that are pretty obvious. This works very well for multi-sport athletes. It works if you have a ton of different competitions kind of randomly scattered throughout the year. If you're a sport where there isn't really a defined off season, this works very well. And I think really critically, this is going to help you make smart decisions every day about monitoring for overtraining symptoms or signs. Okay, so almost done. So stages, I kind of talked about this. If we're working with active start and fundamentals, maybe the only thing you need to do, I talked about those big 4 things we want to monitor: external, internal, wellness, and readiness. Maybe if you're working with active start and fundamentals, I'm probably not going to stick an accelerometer on a 5-year-old in their pre-K class. Probably not. I mean, that would be interesting, but I'm probably not going to do it. I don't think the parents would love that too much. So maybe you ask one question. You say, hey, are you having fun today? I mean, frankly, at that level, that's really all that matters. Are they having fun? So who really cares about all that other stuff? Maybe when we get into the learn to train, we start to say, hey, this would be a really cool time to introduce a simple wellness questionnaire. Maybe we pull out 2 questions like, what's your energy like? And, did you sleep well? We're starting to introduce some of these sports science concepts, and you can maybe even introduce some workload. And maybe it's RPE. We stick with internal workload really easy, and we stick with RPE. As you get, even past train to train, if that's train to compete, train to train, or train to win, excuse me, now we can start to layer in all 4 of those things. We're going to use more advanced tech. We probably need an athlete management system to actually collect all this data and to make visualizations and to make, automated statistical reports, all those good things. And there's one I really want to talk about here in just a sec. But again, what we talked about earlier was, when you're working with athletes who are far away from their genetic limit, certainly traditional models work great. That parallel training model where you train everything, throw it all in the blender at once, that's cool. As you get into those kind of elite levels, you're probably going to have to shift into that block or pendulum models. And the really tricky one is train to train. So for those of you working at the train to train, sort of that early teenage years, this is definitely the most difficult. And I'm going to explain to you why that might be. So here's a nice visual of why that is. So if you look at 2 13-year-old basketball players here, do you think those 2 athletes can handle the same level of workload, intensity, and volume? I would suggest probably not. One already has pretty defined muscle mass. The other looks like he's in kindergarten. You really need to be sensitive to those different things. And those 2 athletes are going to need different plans. So again, when we're working with that train to train level of athlete, you do want to pay attention to their peak height velocity, or in other words, their growth spurt. So, in girls, we kind of expect that peak height velocity, the PHV, it's going to happen somewhere around 12, maybe 11, somewhere in that ballpark. With boys, we know what happens a little later. Maybe it's 13, maybe it's 14. Okay, so if we're working with young girls, probably they're going to experience that peak height velocity a little earlier, boys a little bit later. So again, if you have boys and girls in your training group, that's certainly one thing to consider. And there's a really major reason why the growth spurt and the peak height velocity, which are the same thing, why they're super important. And here it is. So when an athlete is going through their growth spurt or peak height velocity, and then they overcome that, and there's that, they kind of get through that growth spurt, and now there's a deceleration of growth. That is often accompanied by a loss of coordination. And this you see almost always. And the more growth that happens, the greater the loss in coordination. So I'll tell you a very real example of this. One of my buddies, when I was in high school, he was about 5'9" in grade 12, or excuse me, in grade 9. We went away for a summer. In grade 10, he was 6'8". So he grew almost an entire foot in 3 months. So you can imagine that he went from being really coordinated, really athletic, and he had now these gangly limbs, long limbs. He had no idea how to move his body, and that's a really extreme example, but this does happen for virtually every athlete. Maybe not as severely, but it does happen. So whenever an athlete has gone through that growth spurt, we need to be sensitive to that and say, hey, there's going to be a loss of coordination here. And so what you need to do is adjust your training, your competition, and your recovery programs to make sure that we can kind of maintain through that period of awkwardness. So you might have to reduce the volume. Maybe you're going to back off on the intensity. Maybe you're going to pick drills that are a little bit more simplistic. You're going to have to bring it back a little bit. And we're going to try to maintain them through that awkward stage. And then hopefully what will happen if we do that is they'll come out of it better and stronger and fitter and ready to roll. But what happens is if you try to push them through during that really awkward phase, that's a really prime time for athletes to get hurt. And what do we know about athletes around the teenage years is a lot of them drop out of sports. And one of the major reasons for that is due to injury, unfortunately. So this is a really prime time for serious injuries to happen because of that loss of coordination. So again, as coaches, we've got to be sensitive to that. You can track their height. That's another really simple thing you can do. Maybe 2-3 times a week even, have them come in, take a super quick measurement on a tape measure, and just track that. And as you see, and as you're plotting it, you say, hey, wow, this kid is really shooting up in his growth here. That's a signal to you that they're probably going through their growth spurt, and maybe just to back off. Some simpler drills, maybe stuff they used to be really good at, they're not so good at anymore. So take it a step back, reteach them, retrain them. We want to maintain them through that awkward stage so that they still enjoy their sport. They don't get hurt. They don't drop out. And then hopefully what they'll do is come out, better and stronger as they've grown. So that's a really critical stage. And that's one of the tricky parts when you're working with that train to train level of athlete. Okay, last thoughts here. And then we have about 15-20 minutes for questions. So what we want to try to do is move to a flexible model of periodization that utilizes daily monitoring. So again, traditional periodization is terrific. Do it, but again, it's got to be done in pencil. And we want to start to layer in some of these daily monitoring tools and switch into more of a flexible model. We want to select monitoring tools that are realistic. That's the thing. So they've got to be practical to your environment. They need to be affordable, and they need to be time efficient. For me, I have a big staff with the Devils, so we can do a ton of different measurements with a lot of different tech. And, I have automated systems, and, I have a PhD, and I can do stats, and I can do all these fancy things. You don't need to have all that. It can be really simple. And then again, you can always work with a sports scientist. You can work with a strength coach. You can call up whoever you want to call up to get some advice. I would really recommend that. And they can help you set up your preseason evaluations. They can help you set up your monitoring strategies. They can help you answer questions about your data. If at the end of every month you're like, wow, I'm looking at the data, I don't really know what this is telling me. Reach out to somebody who's an expert in this area and to say, hey, what do you think? What does this tell you? And again, it's going to spark some really awesome, really important conversations between your coaching staff and your athletes. So there we have it. Thank you guys very much for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something. Like I said, this is a really broad, big topic. So I hope I kind of gave you the fundamentals there. And please fire away with questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, Penny, I think the questions would be coming into Whova, am I correct?
They should be. Or people could unmute themselves, put their hand up. We can call on them.
If no one has some, I definitely have one. So.
Well, as people compose them, you can either type your questions into the Whova, or you can just raise your hand here. There's reactions at the bottom of your screen, or at least there should be. It's hard to know what you have in Whova. For some reason, I can't join in Whova, so I don't see what everybody sees. I can only join in Zoom. So you should be able to have a reaction or just unmute yourself and jump in, and we will try to help out with that. Anybody want to start us off?
Curtis.
Oh, yeah, I've got a question. What would be like a really good active recovery?
Oh, you froze. Bad
Every day.
times.
Sorry, Curtis, can you repeat that? You're cutting out, buddy.
He totally froze up there.
Might have lost him.
Yeah.
You
Oh, look, he came back. Maybe.
Want to try again?
Try again. Say it again.
What would be a good active recovery day in season?
Active, okay, that's a broad one. So
Like a day
specific to
off.
swimming, active recovery. I mean, it can be anything you want. I mean, it's really up to you as the coach to say, what do I think my athletes need? You can do fun things like building in some, with the Devils, we bring a yoga instructor in a few times a week. So yoga is a great one. Often we go swimming. Ironically, probably not for you. You won't do that. Bike rides, rowing ergometers, really anything you can do. An active recovery session really just needs to be low level. So you're just bringing the intensity down, you're bringing the volume down, just something that's different from what you're normally doing. So, in swimming, let's say you're, a front crawl specialist or something, and you're doing a ton of internal rotation of the shoulder. For an active recovery session, maybe you want to try to do something that really promotes external rotation. So maybe get them on a rowing erg where they're doing a little bit more of that external work, or the posterior chain stuff, right? So that would be kind of the focal point. Again, you can do this, you can split this any number of ways, but generally what I try to do in my active recovery sessions is, the muscles that are typically being worked in training, I want to look at the patterns that they're doing. So, that internal rotation example, I want to try to do the opposite in my external, in my active recovery sessions. And then beyond that too, we want to try to build pliability into, those joints that are important. So anytime we do something chronically, of course, you're going to shorten up those muscles. They're going to get a little tighter, a little stiffer, right? So we want to try to do things that promote opening those up and loosening those up. So yoga is fantastic for that. And again, we might want to focus on those muscles that are getting worked a lot. If I'm a tennis player and all I do literally is internal rotation on my right side 1,000 times a day, again, I probably want to do some sort of stretching for my chest, for my shoulders, right? For my triceps, those different things. So that's kind of the approach. Again, it can be really anything you want, but I would focus on sort of the opposite of what you're normally doing in terms of the movement patterns. Does that make sense? Perfect.
Bart, go ahead.
Hi. I'll turn my camera on because it's kind of creepy without it, I guess. Our season traditionally on the training side is 12 to 16 weeks. And I would say the majority of our athletes, I know on our team, were 12 and under. So pretty young. Yet the events we're asking them to swim are high sprint or sprint. I don't know, in your opinion, how much of the training should be purely skill-based versus work? I don't know, sprint work versus even aerobic work when the majority of the races are, let's say, under a minute 30.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a really broad answer, and I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but this is truthfully my philosophy is, when I'm talking about athletes who are 12 and under, I mean, for me, it's all skill work. It's largely skill work, right? And you're going to try to build general capacity in the engine that matters. So if they're sprinters, for sure, you want to start doing some sprint specific work. That's great. But, you don't want to completely ignore the other things too, right? Because who knows if they're actually going to be sprint specialists when they're 16, 18, 22, so you don't want to neglect the aerobic capacity side of things, which is again, why with younger athletes, we tend to like sort of that parallel model where you're kind of working on everything. Because again, they're going to get better at everything. Like these kids are so far from their genetic limit that they're going to show improvements across a lot of different things. Now, having said that, of course, everyone's got a genetic predisposition to be better at some things than others. Like for me personally, I was a sprinter in high school. I've always been good at sports that are like sprint, power, speed, that kind of work. And I suck at aerobic capacity. I'm terrible at it. And that's just my genetics. There's no getting around it. You know, my wife is the same. So our 10-month-old son is probably going to be fast, but can't run for very long. He's probably going to be just like his parents. You know, so there's a genetic component to that too. But, you know, like certainly when he's young, I'm going to encourage him to do a little bit of everything, you know, throw it all in the blender. But, you know, for me, it's really like focus on the skill development. You know, with the young athletes, I devalue winning so much. Like for me, this is just my personal opinion. I don't care about winning when they're 12, 11. I mean, it's great. I mean, everyone likes to win, don't get me wrong, but that shouldn't be the singular focus of your program. You know, like I tell hockey coaches this all the time. It's like, you know, what should I focus on in my practices? Should we work on like systems and tactics, or should we work on skill development? It's like, well, what do you think you should work? Of course you should work on skill development, right? You can learn systems later, right? So I would really say like focus on the fundamental skills, and then in terms of the like physical preparation side, you know, throw it all in the blender, expose them to everything, and you're going to kind of see then, you know, which kids kind of rise to the top in terms of the sprints, which kids, you know, might end up making better like longer distance swimmers, and you're going to get that as they age out. So I would encourage you to just do everything, have fun with it, do a little bit of everything, and I think you'll be better off for it.
All right. Bit of a joke, but do the hockey coaches listen to you?
Say again, sorry?
Said a bit of a joke, but do the hockey coaches actually listen to you?
Well, depends on the
This
coach.
year, it was all practice, so maybe.
Yeah, it depends on the coach. Yeah, we've had some interesting conversations, let's say that.
I'm sure you have. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I might ask mine here because it kind of rolls into what Bart was talking a bit about. We have sort of this new, it's not new, it's been around for a while. There's this fad training method in swimming called USRPT, which is ultra sprint training. So basically high intensity all the time. You train fast, race fast, low intensity. And I know that you talked about these sort of parallel models and the pendulum model and pieces like that. Do you think USRPT actually has sort of a place in our sport? I'm kind of torn about it too, because we kind of implement it, but we kind of don't. And, you know, I sort of want to know from your opinion and your experience, what's your thoughts on that type of model? Yeah,
I mean, in a broad sense, like, I guess the question would be why? You know, why are you doing it? That's always my question with everybody is like, you know, some people will come to me with like the craziest ideas. I'm like, okay, but why? Like, what's your why? If you can tell me the why, then yeah, you should do it. So, you know, sprint training is awesome, and sprint training is actually great for everybody. You know, this is true for like triathletes, like Tyler Mislachuk, who I've trained, who's an Olympic triathlete. You know, he does sprint training because it's shown to improve running economy. So sprint training in the pool will improve your swimming economy. So even if you are a long distance swimmer, you for sure can do sprint training. There's nothing wrong with that. Should it make up the bulk of your program if you're a long distance swimmer? Probably not. But, you know, should you sprinkle it in? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's really just, again, your why. You know, are you doing it as like a supplemental piece to promote economy and to maybe promote some of that like neurological training that you don't necessarily get at lower intensities? Or maybe it's you want to really try to push them mentally to really experience super high intensities, or to just experience swimming at a faster pace. Like, all of those are good reasons why to do it. You know, for anyone who says, you know, you should be doing this all the time, that should be the bulk of your program, you know, I would challenge them and say, well, why? Give me your rationale for that. Because to me, there just wouldn't really be a valid reason to do that singularly. Does that make sense, Lee?
Yeah. I'm questioning it too all the time because you know, the classic model is you have to build the aerobic base to get the work in so you can start progressing, you know, building off that, and then getting into the sprint work. But you know, with our 4-month season, a lot of times it's like, well, let's just, you know, and all we do is sprints. The longest race is 200 meters. Like, can we just hammer out USRPT the whole season? Would it be a more beneficial method for our athletes in the long run? I don't think so, but like within the season, maybe, you know. So I'm torn.
Yeah, it's tricky, and you know, I don't have a perfect example for you. Like, I guess I would really have to know kind of like what work to rest ratios are. Like, how do your competitions work? Like, is it one, you know, 25-meter sprint per day? Because if that's the case, then yeah, maybe sprint work really does need to be the bulk of it. But you know, if you're having athletes who are doing, you know, multiple disciplines and they're doing multiple races in a day, like then it kind of changes my answer. So, you know, really it's very specific to the work to rest ratios, the structure of your competition. You know, there's a lot of information that I would kind of need to know to kind of tell you how much to prioritize. But in a very broad sense, yeah, I think for sure, if you are coaching sprint disciplines, yeah, it can certainly make up a large portion of your program. But I do say, again, broadly speaking, I think coaches do often neglect the aerobic side way too much, because with the aerobic side, it's going to give you more capacity to train more. So you can recover better between each session, between each repetition. In hockey, as a simple example, we do shifts, right? So each shift is pretty high intensity, but we need to recover between each of those shifts. And that's all happening through aerobic metabolism. So if I ignore my aerobic system, they're not recovering. So, both play a role. It's really just, again, why are we doing it? And that'll kind of guide your priorities.
Awesome. Thank you. I see Bart's hand again.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up, Lee, because I've done a lot of reading on it, and I've experimented a little bit with it, with the ultra sprint training. I think it really took off in the swimming world, I think, because traditionally in the swimming world, and you can tell by my hair color, I've been doing this for a few years. It's really been just volume, and high intensity volume with probably a pretty high amount of injuries. A lot of programs, I won't name programs, but in the year-round programs, especially, that's where I grew up swimming, and that's where I grew up. That's where I did most of my coaching. And then my own children started coaching, swimming in the summer club, which is 4 months, which I think is just phenomenal. And I think it really took off because of that. I think a lot of coaches are like, I don't have the pool time to be able to do this much volume. And it's almost like I have this feeling like in the year-round programs, it's going to find a balance between the two at some point, where people realize you can't just always train like that. You can't just always train high volume. There's got to be a balance somewhere in there. And I think in our league, I'll just say, I think in our league too, I think for 8 months of the year, depending on what they're doing, if they're playing hockey, if they're playing lacrosse, if they're playing basketball, they're getting a lot of their aerobic capacity training when they're away from our sport for the other 8 months. So I think, again, there might be a place. I think there is a place for it within our short season as well.
Yeah, that makes total sense for sure. And I think what you just mentioned there really speaks to the importance of periodization, athlete monitoring, or daily monitoring, understanding, why are athletes getting hurt? Well, maybe it's because we're not doing those recovery weeks at the end of each training block. Maybe it's because, we're just not paying enough attention to the signs that are happening every day. So I think the more we can kind of get every coach doing this daily monitoring, some of the basics to periodization. And again, it can be on a low level. It doesn't need to be big budget. It doesn't need to be high tech. It can be really simple stuff. I think the more we can do that kind of stuff, it's been proven 1,000 times. It reduces injuries. It improves performance. It keeps people in the sport. That's the big thing. Especially when we're talking young athletes here, our dropout rates in every sport it's embarrassing. We're getting 40% of young athletes quitting sports. That's really sad. And a lot of it's because they don't enjoy it. They're hurt. They feel like they don't have enough time in their life. That's sad. For somebody who has dedicated his life to sport, that genuinely makes me sad and upset. That's a terrible thing. So I think we really need to encourage people to promote recovery. And the best way we can possibly do that is pay attention to the daily monitoring stuff. Take the time to do a periodization plan. And it really should be an expectation of all coaches. And, and training needs to be available. So I think, Penny and for the committee who put this together, I think it's fantastic. This is stuff that everybody should be learning. And there's a lot of great people out there to teach it.
I see that Dave has his hand up there.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. So how do you adapt programs to work around athletes' injuries, such as tendonitis from overuse? So sort of speaking to the injury thing, how do you adapt when kids are injured?
Yeah, so it's a tough one to answer. Depending on the sport and depending on the activity, we can try to do things without the injured limb. So in hockey, for an example, I'll tell you a real example. I was just working with an athlete who sprained his MCL. So, we couldn't really do a whole lot on his right leg. So, we could do stuff on his left side. We could do upper body workouts. We could do some cardio through upper body ergs. What we're going to really, any sort of itis is really just inflammation. So if you have tendonitis, bursitis, it's inflammation in the bursa, it's inflammation in the tendon, whatever. All that's saying to you is you're just doing too much of the same thing. So again, one of the powerful things you can do is start to do the opposite. So, again, like I was telling Curtis, if I'm a swimmer and I'm constantly doing internal rotation and I've developed some tendonitis here, the best thing you can do loosen up and stretch those overused muscles and start to strengthen the muscles that oppose them. That's truthfully one of the best things you can possibly do. And then try to stay fit by doing other things that don't involve that specific movement. So, like I said, the tennis example, if internal rotation on my right side is triggering tendonitis in my right shoulder, maybe I start to do some external rotation stuff. I do some rowing. I can do some like cycling to keep my cardio up. I can do some running. Maybe I just try to keep my right arm a little bit more stationary. Whatever, right? You can plan all those things and pick those up. But again, you're going to just have to avoid that injured joint and avoid the specific movements that cause the pain. That's really the best thing you can do. And just try to manage through different modalities and therapies and physio and AT and cold and heat and stretching and all those other things.
Thanks.
No problem.
Any other questions at all? Arata?
Hi. So yeah, like Bart was saying earlier, we have a 16-week-ish season. So how can you kind of break that down? Should you bother making it a macro cycle, one huge thing, or just worry about the mesocycles?
Well, so it's tricky, right? How old are the athletes you're working with?
Ranging anywhere from 5 to 14, 15.
Okay, so yeah, you're still pretty on the young side.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a 16-week in season, right? So their first competition is roughly when?
June, maybe
June?
end of May.
Okay, and that'll carry kind of to the end of summer, basically?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess the Summer Swimming Association, that should have been a clue.
Yeah.
Yes. So
That's
you've got,
great health orders.
yeah. So, over those 16 weeks, like what basically ends up happening in your in-season is the focus needs to be competition, of course, and sport-specific training. So you're going to be in the pool a lot. You're going to be focusing on the disciplines that you're focused on. But that's totally okay. That's really what the in-season is meant to do. Your physical development of your bioenergetic system, like cardio, your lactic system, alactic system, your strength, power, all those things, all of that really should happen outside of your in-season, because the reality is in your in-season you just don't have a lot of time to do that, right? Because you're training, you're practicing, you're competing. Now, when you're working with 5-year-olds, I fully understand, and even 14-year-olds, you probably don't have control over their entire yearly training program, which is their actual macro, right? So understanding that and getting a sense maybe of what other sports your athletes are playing, maybe you can talk to the parents and say, hey, Billy this season, really probably could improve his cardio. Maybe you could try putting him in soccer, or maybe you could try try to find ways to kind of, I don't want to say manipulate, that's not the right word, but, maybe try to influence what they're doing when they're away from your program, because you only have 16 weeks of control, right, over what they're doing. And your 16 weeks is going to be pretty dedicated to in the pool, competing and focusing on their specific disciplines, right? So again, all of that preparation is happening outside of your program. So any little thing you can do to kind of have a positive influence on that and to foster the things you need out of your program, I think is good. And I think most parents, if you pitch it to them that way, especially if they're really dedicated to your sport, and say, hey, this kid here could really benefit from this. Have you tried this, this, and this? I think most parents would be somewhat willing at least to listen to you. Will they follow through? Who knows? Every parent's different, but I think that's probably the approach you would take, because again, your sphere of control is that 16 weeks. A macro cycle, like I said, it's the full year, which you have very limited control over. So for you, when you're in season, you're just going to have to prioritize for each athlete what you think they're going to most benefit from, and prioritize that way, because you just have a limited amount of time. You can't do everything at once when you have that short of time.
That's awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
We'll go to Curtis probably for our last one.
Yeah, I'm just coming into like the unique challenge of coming off of year and a half off of sport for a lot of these kids. Is there any like science or insight that you have about maybe there being a different way of approaching the start of the season as we go from, for some kids, I'm sure, like a year on the couch to swimming full time, more or less?
Yeah. So, I can tell you what the right answer is. I can almost guarantee that no sport is going to follow it, just because they need to get back to making money and registrations and all that, which I totally respect and appreciate. But the right answer is all of these athletes should be given time to prepare. So they should have an off season. They should have a proper or an extended preseason where, maybe you have like an exhibition season, where, instead of actually diving right into a formal competition, maybe you have a few exhibition tournaments or a few exhibition competitions where over that like 4 weeks or whatever it is, you're going to very gradually progress their volume and their intensity. And you have a couple of these like fun exhibitions where, they're not going to go 100 miles an hour on day one. They're going to, they're going to get the sense of what a competition looks like, get back into the rhythm of competing. But, you're not going to actually necessarily put any value in the result. You're going to be focused on development, focused on training. You're going to have a gradual progression over the course of that extended preseason. And then by the time they get into their formal season, you can start to compete again. I mean, that's the right answer, is you need to gradually progress volume and intensity. I mean, research has shown that literally thousands of times. That is almost singularly the right answer, is just you need to gradually progress these things. But the reality is that going to happen? I have a tough time seeing it because, these sports have been off for a year and a half. Kids want to play. Sports need to make money through registrations and through tournaments and all these other things. And again, and that is not a slight on sports. They need to survive. I get that. So I think as a coach, do your best to be cognizant of that. And, if they have a hard training day, let's say like they are going to get thrown into a competition right away, maybe make sure the next day is a day off. And then your next training session after that is a little bit of an easier one. And then you can, you know what I mean? Like, I think just the best you're probably going to be able to do is managing your daily and weekly recovery. And I think if you do a really good job of that, I think that will help to really mitigate any injuries and burnout and stuff like that. So again, that big picture stuff, it's, I always think of recovery this way. You should be able, and I'll end on this note because I know we're going slightly over here. You always need to ask, what am I doing for recovery on an annual basis? So in a macro perspective. And the answer to that should be, my athlete has a postseason. So when we talk about macro recovery, we're talking about making sure the athlete has that postseason, that active rest period. So maybe it's 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Every year they should have 1 to 4 weeks where they're doing nothing related to their sport, or maybe even any sport. Maybe it's just they should go and, play rec basketball or go cycling or, whatever it is they want to do. Go to a yoga class, be active, but it should be non-formal. So that's at the macro level. That's what they need to do. At the mesocycle level, you want to make sure that 1 week out of every month or 1 week out of every training block is reduced volume, reduced intensity. Okay, so that's what you can do at the mesocycle. Is again, one of those training weeks within a training block needs to be a deload week. At the microcycle level, again, 1 day out of every week needs to be an off day. Every athlete on the planet should have 1 day off a week as the bare minimum. That's hard and fast rule. I'm pretty cut and dry about that. You got to have 1 day off a week. Okay, so that's what you can do at the micro level. And then daily, what can you do for recovery daily? You can stretch after the training sessions, those overused muscles. You can use heat, you can use cold, you can do like recovery type, active recovery sessions, all those different foam rolling, right? There's a billion different things you can do. You can promote good sleep, promote good hydration, promote good nutrition. So basically as a coach, you need to say, what am I doing for recovery at the macro, meso, micro, and daily level? And I've just kind of outlined some of those strategies. And I think if you do those things, you're going to find that your athletes are incredibly resilient. Athletes can handle a lot of volume and intensity. They just can't handle it for an extended period of time. And the reality is, if your athlete gets injured for 6 weeks, well, now you might as well have just given them 6 weeks of deload, and it would have been healthier time off rather than 6 consecutive weeks, right? So you're always better to just build more recovery. Like, I've never met an athlete who's too recovered. Never heard of that. I definitely met athletes who are overtrained. So I'll leave you with that note. But again, thank you very much for your time. It was a real pleasure to be here. And I'm certainly happy if any of you want to connect, via email or through LinkedIn or anything like that. If you got more questions, I'm certainly available to answer them. Maybe not during the season, but during my off season, I've got more time. I'm certainly available. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to let Lee do our wrap up here.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for that. That was awesome. I know I have a pile of notes here to add to my planning this year, and I'm sure a lot of coaches do here too. So we really appreciate delving into periodization. It's something we all know about, but often struggle to really implement, and this helps a lot. So thank you so much. I think we're going to move on to
we have a short movement break because we've all been sitting for an hour and a bit. And we had a short movement break scheduled with Ready in 5, who had sponsored us, and I saw the presenter here shortly. He came in, he was all ready to go, and now he's disappeared. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but maybe
I can run a brain break for everyone.
a brain break. What would that
Yeah.
be?
It's the same thing, but
Okay.
different.
Well,
Hello, everyone.
you know, we'll just wait a few minutes. Everybody can get up and walk for a few minutes. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what's happening. I'm going to try to connect with them, but I haven't heard back. So
What's the next thing after the
networks tables is the next one.
and how do we get there?
So on your homepage of Whova, there is, hang on, I got another computer beside me here because I can't do two things at once on that one. So when you just click on the next item on the agenda, which is wine and cheese networking table. And oh, you should be able to just join in there, I believe. But it hasn't started yet. Doesn't start for 5 more minutes.
Grab some water, I guess, and a little snack maybe, and meet
Yeah,
back.
for sure. So we'll see you all at the network tables later, hopefully. I guess we'll sign off from here, and feel free to keep the conversations going in the chat and the message boards, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
I'm going to smile and wave till everyone leaves.
I feel like we're back in COVID cup.
It's very COVID cuppy.
I'm going to end the meeting for everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you in a minute.
Thanks, Lee.